And my apologies to you and to Andrew for having missed both of your addresses, which was inescapable because of roadworks on the way from Maida Vale, where Dr. Helbawy and I were speaking at another event earlier. My thanks to SOAS for allowing this prestigious venue for this, the first public event of the Respect Foundation. And I hope that by the time that we've finished, there will be an appetite for more discursive kind of meetings to the rallies that we quite often attend. Because these are serious subjects of great moment, not just to the people in the countries that we're talking about, but to the region and therefore to the world as a whole. Dr. Kamal was 23 years in exile, 17 of which he spent here in London. We grew to depend on the wise counsel of him and Rashid Ghannouchi, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who is now back in Tunisia. And it's quite a strange thing, Doctor, because we got so used to your presence that, as I'm often looking for you, it's sometimes an irritation, but a delight for you that we can't find you because you're in Tahrir Square in a tent holding court, which is where we are very happy that you are most of the time now. And the tour de horizon of the Egyptian revolution, which you gave, I'm sure will be food for questions, because there's a great hunger here. We're following the events of the Egyptian revolution on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. But I thought that one of the most key points that you made was that when the people are in the square, the military have to give. If the people are not in the square, the military will give nothing. Which is a vindication of revolution as a theory, which all of us actually on this platform have believed in for many a long year. And there were often times when it seemed that we might be wrong. But as Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens, but there are weeks when decades happen. And in the last 52 weeks, we really have seen decades happen. In the last meeting that Dr. Kamal and I were addressing, he said that the West's allies in the region were falling like bricks, which I thought was a wonderful metaphor, because it's clear that all the pillars in the big house that imperialism built to its great profit over the last 100 years nearly is beginning to be demolished, brick by brick. And it will not be enough until that the pillars of that corrupt relationship have been completely destroyed. I sat for nearly 25 years in the British Parliament. I therefore passed every day the room in which Mr. Balfour made his infamous and typically perfidious fork-tongued declaration, just I think 142 words long. 142 words that have produced nearly 100 years of misery and disaster in the Middle East. I had to pass also, almost every day, the room in which Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, the former, a quite remarkable figure actually, about whom I've been reading much more recently. Mark Sykes was a British MP, a kind of ex officio cabinet minister to the war cabinet in the First World War, who called himself an expert on the Middle East, and who was one of the first of what would be quite common actually in the near century that has elapsed since his work. Sykes hated Jews. He was a vicious, foul anti-Semite, but he loved Israel, and he loved the idea of Israel. Like so many, he saw Zionism as a means of ensuring that he would never have to look at Jewish people on the streets of London. He talked openly about we'll be able to clean the East End of London if we can create Israel and by one means or another encourage or otherwise the Jews of the East End of London to go and live in Palestine. He hated Arabs also, whom he described as venal and lazy, and all the casual racist epithets that were thrown about by British imperialists openly at the time, not so openly now, though sometimes sotto voce. Sykes and his counterpart Picot, the French Orientalist from the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry and the French Foreign Policy establishment, literally in a room at the Palace of Westminster, at a time when a quarter of the world and a third of all humanity were being ruled from that building, sat down with a blank map of the Middle East and with their pencils and rulers literally drew lines on the map and invented countries, divided territories into different countries, and began the task of plotting which corrupt king would be placed on which throne. They had no concept that they'd have to shift to corrupt presidents as well as kings when they were doing this work. In other words, the modern Middle East, as we have come to know it, was an invention in the Houses of Parliament by the Thames in London. These states that have become apparently permanent, and the dictators who were apparently permanent, who presided over them, were in fact a 20th century invention of the British and French imperialists at the time. The Americans had not yet arrived on the stage. But I met a man a few years ago, I don't know if he's still alive, he was 93, a man called Dabbas in Jordan. And in the course of talking with him, I asked him, you were alive before there was anything called Jordan. It didn't exist. None of these countries existed as separate states. Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and Jordan were known as Bilad al-Sham, the land of Sham. And I asked him, what did you call yourself when you were young? And he answered, after a few moments' reflection, we were Arabs. They weren't Jordanians. They didn't have a national flag. They were Arabs. And they believed that they were the same, similar at least, to all the Arabs from Marrakesh to Bahrain. That this was one Arab people with one language, one God, one common culture. And they included, by the way, a significant number of Jews who had lived in Jerusalem in particular for many, many centuries as neighbors and friends of the Muslims and the Christians who also lived there. Much the same as Dr. Kamal described his relationship with many of today's Jews who reject Israel. But this division of the Arab world was, of course, entirely to the selfish interests of the imperial powers. And they squabbled like cats and dogs, they squabbled, with the British perfidious to the last, cheating the French, saying one thing to the Arab revolt that Colonel Lawrence was attached to, one thing to Faisal, one thing to the Arabs about subsequent independence if they would join the British war effort against the Turkish part of the German alliance. And a completely different thing to the French and to themselves in their inner councils. It really does repay study, I say, in this venerable place of study, just how venal the conduct of our country was in the Middle East. And when you hear William Hague, little Willie Hague, opining his great feelings for the security, safety, human rights of the Arab people, it's as well to remember that he sits in the very office where Balfour sat. He walks the very corridors where Sykes and Picot did their dirty job. And of course, the purpose was to loot, to divide and rule the better, to loot and steal the resources of the people of that region, which were even then considerable, and later, with the importance of oil and gas, became very much more considerable still. In fact, there was a debate I've just been reading about between Sykes and Picot over exactly what line the British wanted. And the rubric of Sykes and the British government, that they wanted a line drawn from Acre in Palestine to Mosul in Iraq. And they wanted it for their own resources, and they wanted it to protect, as they put it, the approaches to India, which was then the jewel in their imperial crown. The Sykes-Picot agreement has become one of the most successful political imperial policies in all human history. It has kept the Arabs divided and weak all this time, and they are still divided and weak. If they were united, imagine all that land, all that oil, all that gas, all that water. 350 million of them. They'd be a superpower in the world. Instead of a group of people grouped around a league, which is very much the Vauxhall Conference League. That's a lower division for those who don't follow football. The purposes are clear, but their success has been stupendous. Now you have Arabs ready to die for a flag which was invented by the British in Westminster. You have Arabs who define themselves in places like Lebanon, for example, as not Arabs at all, but Lebanese and maybe Phoenicians or some other fancy talk. It's been enormously successful. And these Arab revolutions